Thank you, members of the media and members of the public. I'm going to, as my colleague Solly Matlatsi said, going to take you through why we're calling for this state of disaster. As I do it, I hope that the lights don't go out, which is a very real possibility. And the reason why we're calling for this primarily is because it's on the lips of every South African. Every South African is saying, thus far, no further. We have had enough. Those are the reasons. And as elected representatives, we are giving meaning to your voice in that regard. Now, very recently, Minister Gordon, the Minister of Public Enterprises, under whose aegis Eskom falls squarely, blithely floated the idea that a stage 8 load shedding is entirely possible and on the cards. This is lamentable. This is shocking. And it represents the end of the road after years of policy failure, ineptitude, malfeasance, corruption, and now a head in the sand attitude from him and his government while disaster looms. This is the sad reflection of what we face, what you face. It's absolutely clear, and it should be to anyone who's got half a brain, that we need to bring additional generation capacity to the grid to prevent this disaster from hitting us in the face. This is why we're doing it, to prevent this mess, to deal with this mess, and to ensure that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So it has to be the end of business as usual, which is why we're calling for an electricity emergency response plan, which must be activated to lay out short, medium, and long-term plans. Now, this plan, which is geared to mitigate the state of disaster, to ensure that it doesn't hit us in the face, as I've said, must involve all stakeholders, from government, industry experts, engineering bodies, independent power producers, civil society, and members of the public. As Solly has said, a whole of society approach. But lamentably, there's been no sense of urgency or accountability on initiatives that have been touted by government as the panacea for the electricity crisis. We need radical measures to avert disaster, which is why we're calling for a state of disaster, so we can do exactly that. There's also been no urgency within government and the regulators in removing red tape, which shackles and strangles renewable energy projects. The Minerals Council of South Africa recently made the startling admission that more than 30 projects in the mining industry for self-generation valued at more than 60 billion rands were being delayed by red tape alone. Remember, load shedding is job shedding, and this could be absolutely clear to everybody with that example in mind. We need to avert this state of disaster. We have in this country a generation shortfall of between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts right now. And it is government's duty to respond with urgency. But does it? If this situation, this state of disaster that's looming, is allowed to degenerate beyond the current stage, then the consequences for our country economically, in terms of security, investment climate, and our socio-economic order will be imperiled. So can you see why we're calling for the state of disaster? It's a proactive measure, not a reactive measure. That's what good governments do. They take proactive steps to ensure the well-being of its citizens, and in this instance, to supply public goods in an affordable and available manner, as is, by the way, the mandate of Eskom. In short, in the short term, South Africa we need to secure in this country an amount of power, a minimum amount of power that needs to be made available from Eskom's power fleets to ensure the minimum demands by consumers. That's you and me. In addition, we need to open up with speed alternative sources of supply to meet the nation's requirements. This needs to be at the lowest cost from whatever source within the existing environment and legal frameworks. If we don't do this, we are facing disaster. I don't need to tell you what life without electricity is. Now, cognizant of these obstacles that we are facing, the DA expects that the state of disaster will at the bare minimum allow for a waiver on the moratorium of all the stringent regulations that are preventing Eskom from pursuing a proper and accelerated onboarding of generation capacity from independent power producers. In addition, this command and control structure, the opacity that exists at Eskom, must end so that contracts can be re-examined to reveal corrupt and conflicted practices. We can't go back to pre-Zondo days. We need to focus on the maintenance and rebuild. This must be quantified, and the workforce must be repurposed with a credible plan actioned against the requirements of a stable power supply. Can't be business as usual, which is why we're calling for a radical alternative. And there is nothing more radical than what we are facing and the alternative that we are proposing to deal with this. 8 years ago, a respected professor in this particular industry, Professor Anton Eberhard, made a public call on government. And he said the following. It fell on deaf ears, of course. But he said, let's understand why Eskom has failed to supply power to our community 8 years ago. Let's draw lessons from this. Let's document the outcomes. Let's make recommendations on the allocation and execution of planning, procurement, contracting functions to bolster generation and transmission capacity. And to assist in accelerating investment, construction and commissioning of new generation capacity, and to fast-track the implementation thereof. Had that been listened to and actioned, instead of putting state councils, presidential councils, war rooms and the like, which have led us not upwards but downwards on a trajectory to complete almost darkness, which is looming, it would have been different. We need action now, lest we descend into darkness with all the dire consequences. That's why we are calling for the state of disaster to be declared.